Mother Ostankya is hitting the scene and bringing a bunch of new Kislev units, padding out the beasts and monsters of the roster, as well as one of the best ranged units in a faction known for ranged firepower. But what are these new units and how do you use them in battle? Well, let's find out. First up, we of course have Mother Ostankya herself. The Stanky Mother is quite a versatile unit. First and foremost, she's a spellcaster with access to a lot of augments and hexes from a mix of beasts and shadows. This makes her into something of a support powerhouse rather than a highly destructive spellcaster. If you're looking for explosive high damage spells, then she's certainly not the Lord for you. Outside of spellcasting, she's also a decent range artillery unit with exceptional missile strength with armor piercing and magical damage. The range itself isn't anything too crazy, being similar to most ranged infantry, but the projectiles go boom and deal great damage, so no complaints here. It's also no large arc, so getting hits onto units locked in the front lines is a piece of cake. And if all this wasn't enough, she's also a decent charging chariot. She has decently high speed, moderate mass, and some great weapon strength and charge bonus. The melee stats and armor really aren't there, so sustained combat is a no-go, but charging in and out will do just fine for some added value. Plus, she can do all three of these jobs at once, as she fires whilst on the move and will have no problem casting spells between charges for a little more utility. Overall, she's a great lord who can pretty much do it all, so makes her an excellent and different leader to the Kislev ranks. Next we have the Hag Witches. Elephant out of the way first. Yep, they should be lords, but they're not, so here we stand. If we make enough noise, maybe they'll add them as lords later on for $5 for a single unit, but we'll just have to wait and see. Outside of that, they're pretty much just heavily weaker Mother Ostankya clones. They still have the charging ability and are in fact a little bit better with more charge bonus, weapon strength and speed. They still have the ranged, but it's a lot less damage, ammo and range. And they still have these spellcasting abilities, but are limited to one lore at a time from a choice of beasts, death or shadows, the latter being my go-to. Honestly, you can use them pretty much the same as the Mama herself. Charge them around in combat, leave them on fire at will for extra damage whilst dropping spells wherever and whenever they're needed. As long as you don't let them get locked down in melee, they should have a great time and rack up a ton of value. Yep, not much to say here since, like I said, they function the same as Mama, but a little worse in most areas. Next up we have the Akshina Ambushers. I feel like I have been missing something here because on paper, these are the most OP unit to be added to the roster. In melee, they're fine in the early game with mid stats and armor piercing damage, but of course, ranged is where they thrive. They're more ranged than Kossars and Streltsy, the most ammo of any ranged infantry, and the most armor piercing by a long way. And yes, that includes Streltsy. And I know crossbows can pierce armor, but you're really going to tell me that they can do it better than an axe with an AR-15 built in? Anyway, you can use and abuse their obscene ranged damage from a decent range to rip enemies to pieces either from the backlines of your own army or a flanking position if you feel the need to. As the name suggests, they're plenty sneaky and can hide in basically any terrain, and when combined with their vanguard and woodsman, they can come from a truly unexpected location to ruin your enemy's day. But keeping them on the backlines is just fine as, like I said, they do the ranged infantry thing better than literally anything else in basically every category. I mean, they have more range damage than both Ice Guard, so if you don't need the magical damage and enhanced melee stats, you can grab these guys and hold on to them for pretty much the entire game. Of course, they're not super tough, but as long as you keep them safe on the backlines and firing, does it really matter? And with that firing arc, that's going to be easy. Next up, we have the Things in the Woods. The Things in the Woods, aside from being a really hard unit to talk about without just referring to them as things, are another excellent addition to a surprisingly stacked monster roster of Kislev. They work as a great counterpart to Snow Leopards, who are single entity anti-large specialists. Instead, the Things are excellent at anti-infantry on the front lines with a high entity count, great armor piercing, and of course that bonus versus infantry. Their melee stats are fine, but you really do need them fighting alongside other units to keep them safe. Alternatively, you could use them to cycle charge to maximize damage, whilst avoiding unnecessary damage onto themselves. Their charge bonus is pretty nice, and with their high mass and speed, they'll hit damn hard and have no problem getting out afterwards. Whatever you do, keep an eye on their HP, since the armor and defense isn't the best, and even with 20% physical resistance, they can go down fast, especially with all the magical damage flowing around these days. Just keep them tagged in infantry, whether ranged or melee, and have them avoid high damage, and they should do just fine. And lastly, we have the Incarnate Elemental of Beasts. This is basically a much bigger single thing from the woods, but it's swapping back over to anti-large. It's not quite in the level of the Elemental Bear, both in size and tankiness, so it's more of a slender, devastatingly damaged single entity, rather than a real frontlines bulwark. You want to use that massive damage to hunt down large targets like other single entities, and take them out as fast as you can to prevent them getting much value. The damage is huge, armor piercing, magical, and with that bonus versus large, you'll have no problem taking on basically anything large one-on-one. Of course, the major thing you have to worry about with this guy is enemy ranged. The hitbox isn't super wide, but it's still pretty tall. This makes them easy tags for any kind of ranged unit, and they will focus it down to get rid of a major threat ASAP. Take out enemy range to keep this unit safe, and let it focus all of its energy onto the frontline threats, and frontlines is exactly where you want to stay, if possible. Not only will the area attacks deal a ton of damage to everything around them, they'll also get value from their Incarnate Flock of Doom ability, dealing constant damage to all nearby units whenever it's healthy. Just keep it battling, monitor its HP so it doesn't get too low, and you should be just fine. I'm also not going to go through these since I've covered them in previous videos, but Mama's faction can also make use of these same forest spirit units that Draker introduced, those being spider hatchlings, cave bats, giant spiders, feral bears, and feral ice bears. Shadows of Change is of course also bringing 3 units of DLC to the Kislev roster. We've got the Wolf Hearts, which are Akshina Ambushers. They gain a little more missile strength from the Pack Trap ability. The Mordheim Beowulfs are things in the woods and lose some melee stats for getting HP, charge bonus, and dark blood tainted attacks. And Bedinov's Brawlers are Streltsy and lose some range to gain melee stats and missile strength. And lastly, we come to the army compositions. Of course, this DLC is introduced in tiers 4 and 5, so instead of our usual comps for tiers 1, 2, and 3, I'm going to make comps for tier 1 and 2, 3, and 4 and 5, since that's how you unlock them in the campaign. So, first up, the early game comp. We're going to bleed with an Ice Witch with Lore of Ice, no new lore type sadly, so we're sticking to the OG choice. Between these and Boyars, it's no contest. Of course, we're going Ice Magic since it's the faction of Ice, and it's also a pretty top tier lore. Got that spell support coming right out the gate if you spend points on it, which you absolutely should. Actual combat use is pretty minimal, so keep them safe on the back lines and casting for plenty of value. For the front lines, we're going to go with 6 Armoured Cossars. These are a classic front lines unit. The regular Armoured Cossars have the best armor and defense we can get at this stage, so it's no brainer to take these guys. Yet they have those pistols for some light burst damage as enemies approach, but we're mainly taking them to be the bulwark of the army and keep enemies still, allowing other units to do all the real damage. We're going to go with 6 Akshina Ambushers for our ranged infantry. Get ready to see a lot of these guys because they are straight up busted. Just going to use them like regular backlines ranged infantry, not even bothering to do any ambushing since they do a more than satisfactory job from right where they are. Keep them out of melee and firing at all times, and you can't really go too far wrong. And closing us out for the monsters, we're going to go with 5 Things in the Woods and 2 Snow Leopards. We're going to split 3 of our things to assist the front lines and have 2 go for flanks with the Snow Leopards. The Leopards are of course going to focus on large threats like cav or mounted characters on the back lines. Things are going to go for enemy range to take them out as soon as possible and keep your army safe. This is all before everyone comes back to the front lines to help out once they run out of targets. Just don't let any of these monsters get pinned down and surrounded, and they should be just fine. Come to our mid-game composition, our Ice Witch should be picking up more of their spells and possibly a mount at this point, still using basically the same on the back lines out of combat and simply providing steady spell support where needed. The late game Lore of Ice is costly but has some excellent casts for damage, defense and offense, so make sure you're using everything that you can to give yourself an edge. We're going to pick up a Hag Witch of Shadows for an extra caster with the ever powerful Lore of Shadows. We're also going to make use of the artillery for more support for our front lines and even more charging if you really feel like it. Just be sure to keep them moving as sustained combat will result in a rapid death. We're going to upgrade our front lines to 6 Sargard, a massive upgrade to tankiness here. Yes, we're losing the ranged burst damage, but it wasn't really the point of the Armoured Cossars, so I think we'll survive. They're just going to stand there and hold enemies still for as long as they can to let your other units do all the real damage, and as long as they can will be a pretty damn long time with their armor, defense and leadership. Sticking with 6 Akshina Ambushers for our ranged, no need to upgrade since they're just that overpowered. The monsters, we are dropping one of our Things in the Woods, dropping one of them to make room for the Hag, and I chose to go with 4 of these since the anti-large of their Leopard isn't amazing and these end up being better in more scenarios. If you want to just keep them on the front lines and use them there, you can. Or you can use them to flank and take out ranged threats if you feel you can handle the micro. Just keep them fighting with support and they'll get you tons of value. And lastly, closing us out with 2 Little Groms for a little more ranged firepower. These will be focusing on the larger armoured threats on the enemy side with massive damage from a large distance whilst also being pretty speedy and able to defend themselves in combat. It's nothing crazy like a Hellstorm, but they'll get the job done as is the Kislev way. And lastly, we come to our endgame composition. The Ice Witch should be in that endgame form on a bear with all the spells and abilities and still be avoiding melee. The bear makes them a tiny bit better, but only use this in emergencies as you don't want them dying or running when there are winds to use. Our Hag Witch of Shadows, same as before, just with all their spells. Keep using them for any combination of casting, shooting and charging, and you should be all good. Got the same infantry lineup as before. If you're against magic, then maybe swap the ambushers for Ice Guard, but against armor, they're still the best. We're completely swapping out the monsters. We're going with 2 Incarnate Elemental of Beasts and 2 Warbear Riders. The Warbears are going to take that backlines role since they're the fastest and will wipe ranged infantry and artillery out in moments if they can pin them down. They're a little bit slow and prone to being caught out, but they're still bears, so can take on most threats pretty well. It's another unit that's normally doing well as long as it's fighting, so as long as it's fighting, it's probably doing well. The Elementals are going to assist your front lines focusing on any large targets to make the most of that bonus. Also be sure to spread them out on your front lines to make sure their direct damage passives are hitting as many units as possible. And of course, watch out for ranged focus, and they should do great. Lastly, 2 Little Groms, same as before, focus on the toughest nut you can and do anything possible to bust it. And that is everything you need to know on how to use the new Kislev units coming with Shadows of Change in battle. Let me know what you think of the new units in the comments below, like, subscribe, and if you want to see more new units from this DLC, then check out this video here to see my guide for all the new Siege units coming alongside the Changeling.